This might be the most infuriating interview I've ever watched. Danny Kruger is often cited as being the brains of the Reform UK operation, and in this lengthy exchange with Emma Webb Trimble on the New Culture Forum, she does a fantastic job. By the way, I'll link the full interview down in the description. Emma, as a member of Reform UK, gives Danny quite a friendly probing on some of the ideas he's said in previous interviews and in his book Covenant, such as that Afghans are equal heirs to the heritage of England as those who are 100% Anglo-Saxon, and other such ideological myths. And Danny responds with wishful thinking the entire time and concedes all of the framing of the things that we're concerned about, things like demographic change and the growth of Islam in the country, and then says, well, but we can't do anything about it because I'm an ideological liberal, and my ideology, which I derive a lot of status and sort of self-soothing moral encouragement from, prohibits me from distinguishing between groups of people, even though I've already recognised that you're distinguishing between groups of people because one group is committing heinous crimes against the other, even though they were never invited here in the first place. So the entire interview is an exercise in him admitting, as an ambassador for Reform UK, that yes, all of these things are problems that the government that Danny was a part of and supported, the Conservative government, all of these things are problems that we caused or exacerbated, but as a Reform government, we won't do anything about them. Let's just watch.
And a big part of that is the collapse of the white British population, a collapse from 73% to 36% by the end of the century. Do you think it's reasonable for people to be upset by this?
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. We're seeing our country transformed within our lifetimes. And
so that's a refreshing change from Nigel Farage saying that demographic change is not his concern and that he's only concerned about cultural change, which is somehow completely distinct from demographic change, even though the culture is named after the demographic, the English or the British, Scottish, Welsh and Irish too. And also Richard Tice saying at that exact projection, well, that's a long way off, I'll be long gone. Like, literally renouncing the duty that he has to consider what he is bequeathing onto subsequent generations. As a father, mind you. Richard Tice doesn't care. Nigel Farage says it's not a concern. Danny Kruger, who's a bit wiser because he speaks to James Orr quite a lot, straight off the bat says, yes, demographic change is a concern. Okay, so we're on the same ground here. Demographic change is the cause of cultural change, and if we become a minority in our own country, we will be mistreated. Much like, as I'm sure Danny knows well, white South Africans in South Africa, because Danny Kruger has South African heritage. Do we want to become South Africa? No. And I'm sure Danny would also say no. So, us agreeing that we don't want Britain to become South Africa should be a thread that runs through this entire interview. The difference is, as we'll see, Danny isn't going to do anything to stop us from becoming South Africa.
And already you've got towns and cities which have changed utterly just in the last couple of decades. So it's absolutely understandable that people are concerned. We all should be concerned, and we need a government that shares that concern.
I should pause there as well. I should have said right at the start, I know some of Danny's staff, and I was clipping this in just a blind rage yesterday. And one of them reached out and said, hey, I don't think you've characterised Danny fairly here. And I said, look, I think I have. I'm not ill-motivated to mischaracterise Danny. Again, I don't want to be a hardcore partisan. I used to be a part of Reform until I was banned by various members of the leadership, so I hear. So, if Reform win the next election, I want them to solve all the problems. But, as we will see here, I don't think their philosophy is adequate. I don't think Danny has the courage. I certainly don't think Farage or Tice has the courage. There are good people in Reform, not just people that are working as backroom staff who don't see much camera time, but, James Orr. Sarah Pochin's proved me wrong. She seemed like quite a capable MP. I quite like Suella Braverman, even though I don't think that she was very successful as Home Secretary, but I believe that she tried. I've spoken to Suella before. I just don't think they're going to do it. And so I want to do this breakdown to make sure I'm accurately representing what Danny says, because by the end of it, I think you'll come to the same conclusion as me, which is we just don't have time for these delusions. Like, The demographic ship has sailed. The problems are already here, as Danny says. Our towns and cities have changed over the last couple of decades. So the question is, are you going to consolidate those changes? Are you going to take those revolutionary gains by previous Labour and Conservative governments as givens, and then just say, well, we have to adapt and manage to them. We have to somehow incorporate these unwanted tribes into our own country? Or are you going to reverse that change? Danny doesn't want to reverse it.
You're a civic nationalist. You've been quite ardent in your position. It's something that you articulate in your book, Covenant. How do you square that and your comments that you made on Winston Marshall's show about how a child that is born to Afghan parents in Britain is as much of an heir to our inheritance as somebody whose ancestors have been here for generations, who have fought wars for this country, who have paid taxes for hundreds and hundreds of years? How do you square your civic nationalist position with a recognition that it's reasonable for people to be upset about the decline in the white British population?
Fantastic question from Emma. She's doing an excellent job of inheriting Peter Whittle's mantle, because this used to be Peter Whittle's show, and Emma has crafted that question masterfully, not antagonistic, but she's pulling on the underlying philosophical thread of what Danny previously said. And it's important, by the way, because both Danny Kruger and Emma Webb Trimble believe that Roger Scruton is a kind of intellectual hero. And look, I've read some Scruton. I like what he's written. But Emma, I think, understands the concept of Roger Scruton's pre-political we, which means before you interface with politics, with the bureaucratic organs of the state, or before you even form a political party and collectively bargain for your interests in the economy, in labour protections, cheaper energy, fixing potholes, whatever, right? You have to define who you are as a constituency. And so to speak about ourselves in terms of we have to have an identity. So identity precedes politics. There is no such thing as politics without identity. All people that complain about identity politics are actually bemoaning is the disruption of the previous settlement we had before mass migration and before things like the sexual revolution and the internet introduced also, various sexual identities into the mix. And before, things got really tense and really existential. Instead, what they want to go back to is a homogeneous society of essentially white Brits who all believed in basically the same religion, all believed in basically the same thing, and just disagreed about marginal tax rates and where to properly allocate the council budget. Great, I'd love to live in that country too. We don't, and that's because you've run a mass demographic experiment on the presumption that everyone around the world will basically think like us. They just haven't realised it yet, and all we need to do is bring them here, give them social housing, give them education and youth clubs, and make them swear an oath to British values, and then suddenly they'll become a British citizen. They will become an heir to the Anglo-Saxons and Athelstan and William the Conqueror and all these things, right? This is what Danny believes. So in Danny's conception, there is no concrete pre-political we. In Emma's conception, there is, and she's trying to gently nudge him to say, don't you think that you've neglected the idea of the pre-political we before you engage in politics? And Danny's just saying, no, because everyone can, purely hypothetically, by the way, rationally subscribe to being a part of our we. And it's like, okay, but they haven't, they won't, they don't, and what happens when they don't? Are there any consequences for that? And the answer to that is no, because it makes Danny feel uncomfortable. So there's no solution to the problems that everyone in this conversation, me now included, I'm throwing myself in the mix, all acknowledge are there, they're real, they are existential. Danny doesn't have a solution.
Because civic rights are exactly that, and it is important that everybody who is a citizen here shares the same rights. They also share the same obligations, of course, and those obligations.
Okay, and when they don't fulfill them, what then? Also, as well, so I spoke to an ex-civil servant recently, and they said even the ideological liberals at the Home Office were saying at the time when the last Conservative government was smuggling thousands of Afghan tribesmen, drug dealers, Taliban fighters, and in the case of Safi Dawood, the man who killed Wayne Broadhurst in broad daylight, actual murderers, as well as all the rapists, poor young girl in Nuneaton, the 15 and 17-year-old that also raped another girl, the rape case just yesterday, at the time of recording, who was a Taliban fighter. All of these people, the Conservative government smuggled into the country because of a Ministry of Defence email leak, and then justified, per Robert Jenrick, as saying, well, welcoming them is a national project. All of these people, even civil servants at the Home Office who are liberals, were saying at the time, why are we doing this? Afghans don't integrate. So they knew what they were doing to us. They knew that this was a reckless experiment. They knew that nobody wanted it. They knew there would be public outrage because they took out a super injunction against the press to stop them from reporting on it. We have got the bodies, we've got the ruined lives, we've got the traumatized children now. We know this was a mistake. We know they don't fulfill their obligations. So why are we speaking in this sort of dream realm of hypotheticals when we've got the actual horrors that have manifested as a result of this policy that should never have happened, should not keep happening, and can be easily prevented by sending them all home? And what Danny is saying is, no, because if we just kind of wait it out and tell them they have these obligations, then they'll somehow just fulfill them, even though later he says, as a liberal, we can't force people to live a certain way. And then later says, but we must use schools to try and separate children from their parents to make sure they don't adopt their immigrant heritage culture and adopt British values, even though you can't define them. So basically brainwashing the children of immigrants into acting like us, like a kind of cargo cult. So we have to enforce the obligations, but we can't enforce the obligations because we're liberals, but we have to turn the entire country into the Michaela school. Literally an example he cites. It's incoherent. It's just not going to work.
By the way, in my view, extend beyond simply obeying the laws. They are an obligation on us to respect the inheritance that we have. But I think it is important to hold this line, to say that a child born in this country with rights of citizenship is the heir to all of the amazing inheritance which the English and the British people have produced.
English and British people. They are not our people. Because nations are families of families. They are a separate family. They have been a very close-knit family, given the rates of cousin marriage, halfway around the world in total isolation from us for millennia, and have developed their own culture, their own heritage, their own heroes, their own frame of reference, and they don't value the things that we value. And so, why would they buy into our inheritance when they have one of their own? Why would they revere our heroes when they have heroes of their own that have very different values, a very different story of what is heroic? But if you're a Christian Englishman, you think that a very different side of the Crusades was correct to an Afghan Muslim. So, why, if they are not part of our ancestral line, if they are not part of our pre-political we, if they do not say, this is my inheritance, before exploring it, why would they come to the conclusion that it is their inheritance when exploring it, rather than come to the conclusion that, hey, here's this rich culture that has, for 1,000 years or more, actually been in direct conflict with our own culture, Christianity and Islam, for example. Or if you just look at the various conflicts that the British Empire, or even the Russians, if you want to expand across European Christendom, or just, very recently, the UK and America, they've literally been in our land fighting our goat herders armed with AK-47s and sticks. Why would they come to the conclusion that our traditions and heritage is more compatible with theirs than it is that they are an enemy of us? Because that's exactly happened, by the way. That's happened with second-generation Muslim immigrants in Britain. That's why the 7/7 bombers were second-generation Pakistanis. That's why the Manchester Arena bomber was second-generation Libyan, born in this country. Like, Axel Rudakabana, Southport killer, born in Wales, not a Welsh choir boy, really hated white people to the extent where he stabbed 3 children to death and injured a bunch more. Why would they come to the conclusion that they are one of us, rather than that what they understand about us is opposed to us? Because I've done the same thing. I've read quite deeply into Islam at this point, and I recognise, bloody hell, this doesn't belong anywhere near Britain. Because even if practiced peacefully, we won't have the same civilization. Ayaan Hirsi Ali calls this practice cocooning, where immigrant families will move to a Western country for economic opportunities. But in order to retain their culture and identity, they will hunker down and double down on practices like female genital mutilation and face veiling and honour killings and Salafist interpretations of the Quran. They'll be like brushing their teeth with a stick and going on Hajj. So, we know this happens. Why are you speaking in the realm of hypotheticals as if a bunch of Afghans will adopt our heritage as our own? And why should we have to wait for this when we never wanted them here in the first place? And, okay, if they don't adopt the heritage, what then? Nothing.
Over the centuries, and our challenge as a society is to ensure that the numbers of people that we welcome into our country are manageable, so that as they in turn have children, we are creating a society that is genuinely cohesive.
Okay, but we haven't. The numbers argument is moot at this point because millions and millions of people were brought here against our wishes. They're here. Are you going to get rid of them? If not, then this entire conversation is pointless because you will not arrest the inevitable decline of the white British into a hated minority in their own country, which we all agree at the very start of the conversation is a problem. So the inflow is besides the point. Like, if your house is flooding, turning off the tap is one thing, bailing out the water is another. What Danny Kruger is saying is, put on your armbands and a rubber ring that's shaped like a duck and learn to swim. It's like, no, actually, I would like my house back.
So, of course, I recognise that this country is the product of generations of people who have a sense of their own kinship with the generations that have gone before. And to a degree, whether consciously or not, they were building a society for their descendants. And there is something wrong with an arrangement that we've created for ourselves unwittingly.
This bit makes me angry. Okay, if you recognise that you had a duty to the people who built the civilization and wanted to bequeath it to their descendants, then why do you now feel entitled to say that other people can also be the heirs to that inheritance? Like, for example, if I just self-identify as a member of someone else's family, I can't write myself into their will. So why do you get to do that if you're from Afghanistan? Or any other country, for that matter? Especially when it's against the wishes of the host population. And then there's the insinuation that we created this arrangement unwittingly. We didn't. We know who did it. So Andrew Nether, who is the speechwriter for Blair, said that the Blair government wanted to rub the right's nose in diversity and render its arguments out of date. David Cameron was swanning around Conservative events, saying we need more Muslims in business, in leadership, at the higher echelons of the Conservative Party, a Muslim Prime Minister someday. We know for a fact that members of the Conservative Party elected Kemi Badenoch, their leader, because they said, this was Charles Moore that said this, that a black woman leading the oldest political party in the Western world would be a sight for sore eyes. We know, for example, that Boris Johnson said he did the Boris wave because he wanted to open the floodgates to make the Financial Times like him again, so that raw bodies could soak up all of the quantitative easing that had been produced during COVID, keep inflation down, and stop wages from rising, being a boon to big business. So we know that people did this deliberately, and Danny Kruger's acting like it just fell from the sky. Like, no, we know who the culprits are. We know who's been brought here. We know it was in unfathomable numbers. They're committing unspeakable crimes, and it was against the express wishes of the voting public at every election since the 70s. So it can all be undone, and everyone that is responsible should face consequences. At the very least, they should be stripped of their pensions and banned from ever working for the public sector again. But many of them, Priti Patel, Boris Johnson, Tony Blair, should be in prison. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not actually going to solve the problem. And I think you've profoundly misjudged the level of public outrage about this.
Without permission, that the state has over recent decades created a arrangement in which literally millions of people have come to this country and then themselves had children who do not feel part of our nation, and that is wrong. But
why is it wrong? No, explain, why is it wrong? It's wrong because you want the outcome of a cohesive society. So if we agree that is the outcome that you desire, then we must reassess whether or not the policies that brought us to this point were ever going to create a cohesive society. We must assess whether or not it is possible for all of these people to describe themselves as one of us. And we just know that it isn't. Because they're not part of the pre-political we, they're not bought in via ancestry to our inheritance, and very few can ever identify in, or even be welcomed in, because we have those named exceptions from other societies. I mean, I'm sure we've all got friends like this, right? Fine, whatever. There are people in the space, I'm sorry to use them as examples, but Momus Najmi or Naraya Khan or Ayan Hirsi Ali. But we know that all of Pakistan is not like Momus Najmi. We know that all of Somalia is not like Ayan Hirsi Ali. Otherwise, it wouldn't be like Pakistan. It wouldn't be like Somalia. So, if most people can't do that, if that's the case, and yet you still want the outcome of a cohesive, peaceful, prosperous society, then you have to admit that most people don't belong in that vision of a cohesive, prosperous society as you would like it, and so they shouldn't be here. But again, not willing to reverse that, just willing to turn off the tap and tell you to swim in your own house.
But I do hold this line about the rights of people born in this country to be full citizens with everybody else. The challenge is how to ensure that we don't have too large an influx, and that those who are born here genuinely understand the country that they belong to, and they respect not just its laws, but its culture as well.
But they don't belong. It's not their culture. And you're right. How do we do that? Oh, that is the challenge. Okay, your solution will not answer that problem. So we just have to find a different solution.
It sounds as if your argument for saying what you did about, just to take the example of what you said on Winston's show about the newborn Afghan to Afghan parents, fully British citizenship, and as you said, heir to the tradition of the Saxons, Alfred, and so on, exactly the same as you or I. It sounds as if what you're describing there in terms of your sort of covenantal civic nationalist perspective is that the reason for that is to bring them into belonging here, to graft them on to the British family, to the national family. But do you think it's unreasonable for people to feel as if what you're really saying by that is that, in a sense, your ancestry counts for nothing? It doesn't give you some kind of prior claims, some kind of deeper sense of belonging, that actually, if you recognise that the family is the basis of our society, and that it's about families belonging in a place over time, that actually that does give some kind of weight to ancestry and belonging? Or are you trying to say, actually, this is just bringing people in and giving them the opportunity over time to become part of that?
Great question by Emma, just perfectly worded. Obviously, that's the case. Like, obviously, people are going to feel frustrated that you have treated their identity as incidental, despite naming the difference between Afghans and Anglo-Saxons, by the way. So you recognise the difference, despite acknowledging that demographic decline is a problem, but instead you're just telling them that they can't do anything about it, so they just sort of have to accept becoming obsolete in their only homeland. But there's a few problems here. So, first of all, speak about grafting on. Let's use the example of a salix tree. I've got a bit of a green thumb. I love a bit of gardening, only thing that keeps me sane. Salix trees are usually grafted on to another sort of cut of a tree, like usually an apple tree. Over time, that salix tree takes over the apple tree. It basically parasitizes it. It incorporates it into part of itself. And so the thing that is grafted onto the thing that's already there usually subsumes the thing that's already there. So I don't want to get subsumed by Muslim tribesmen, by Afghans, by Indians, by any other civilization. I'm still upset about the Glorious Revolution when a Dutch guy imposed himself on us. Only half joking. I don't want the grafting to become the dominant characteristics of the country that they're being grafted into, because that country ceases to be the same country. It ceases to be my country. But the important meta point about this question is that Emma is throwing a lifeline to Danny here, because Danny was heavily criticised for his Winston Marshall appearance. Danny admits that he has been monitoring the feedback online, the criticism of him. And so, Emma's saying to Danny, but don't you recognise that there is something important here, something that people feel deeply, a sense of identity, that cannot just be strip-mined out and substituted with civic nationalist, liberal, ideological fictions that say we can just chop and change our national identity, our loyalties, our sense of belonging, as we so choose. It's basically like being ethnically non-binary. Like, oh, I'm Afghan today, I'm English tomorrow. I'm basically ethnic fluid. That sounds wrong. So Emma is saying to Danny, yeah, but hang on a minute. Don't we need to recognise the boundaries of reality here? Don't we need to recognise that ancestry and identity and lineage are consequential whether or not you would like them to be, and so we have to deal with the world as it is? And Danny goes, yeah, sure, that exists, but I'd rather retreat into my liberal fictions and continue to insist that we all have to eschew that, including the newcomers that don't share any of my liberal priors and therefore are less likely to eschew that, so we can all just live together with no problems. And I'm sorry, Danny, they're not going to do it. We're not going to have no problems, because we've already got problems, because we're already in the midst of this experiment rather than at the start of it. And what I think what Emma's done here is give Danny a way out. It's being charitable. If you're in 2022, 2023, and let's say Danny doesn't know about the Afghan situation, right? His government did it, but let's say he doesn't know. Let's say you're in Devizes, which is Danny's constituency. It's like 99.9% white British. Let's say you're very wealthy because you're the son of Prue Leith, the famous host of Great British Bake Off. Let's say that you just spend a lot of your time as an MP writing speeches and doing parliamentary debates about issues of clear moral conscience. Don't get me wrong, he's very good on assisted dying and abortion. And let's say that you are entirely detached from the demographic change that is happening over there somewhere. So it's not your immediate consequences. What Danny could have turned around to Emma and said is, you know what, I said that in a book about 3 or 4 years ago. And I said that again on a podcast when I was pressed on it. And then people made some really good arguments to me. And then people pointed out that as a consequence of me thinking that Afghans can become just as English as you and me, Emma, the government imported a bunch of people. Not directly because of me, but because of the same strain of thought. They imported a bunch of people from Afghanistan who, it turns out, are like loads of murderers and rapists. And now there is an increasing salience of the British people of their own identity as a defensive mechanism, in contrast to all the people we've imported that are committing unspeakable crimes against them. So you know what? I've reassessed. No, Afghans can't just become English, and there are actually cultures that are degrees of separation so far removed from our own that they're basically not compatible. And to protect our own people, who have our primary moral concern, because they've got no other country to go to if this fails, to protect our own people, we just shouldn't bring those people here, and we should get rid of the ones that we already have. So Emma gave Danny a route out to say, you know what, I was wrong. I basically indulged in a luxury belief when I thought it had no consequences for me. I was signalling my virtue. I was sitting in this ivory tower of philosophical abstractions, basically doing a Roger Scruton tribute act, talking about things like belonging and reverence for a heritage in the abstract, the importance of culture, whether or not it is your own. I was talking about things in these very rational, distant ways. But now the consequences of reality have repudiated my abstract pontificating. I have reassessed. And you're right, Emma, and we should do something to address the demographic change that we all admit is a problem. And instead, Danny says, no, we need to police this line. We need to tone police our own side when they say Afghans can't become English. So you are saying, no, I am, despite the horrible consequences of my politics, I am going to act as a gatekeeper and say these people have to stay here, their children can become just as English as you, and we can't remove them because that would be icky. I'm not for this. It's wishful thinking that's going to get people killed.
Well, I am saying, as you put it very well, that the reason for insisting that we all share the same civic rights and, in a sense, the identity as Britons, as citizens of this country, is to ensure that we have equal obligations on everybody, and it's not acceptable to say that you have alternative loyalties elsewhere. So.
But they do. You can morally condemn it all you like, but if you're not going to bring any consequences to bear on the fact that they do, and we know they do, because so-called Afghan asylum seekers in Germany kept going back to Afghanistan on holiday, the Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Indian communities in our country leverage their demographic might as democratic pressure to elect representatives for themselves, whether that's the Aspire Party in Tower Hamlets, who are very progressive in this country, but running as actual Bangladeshi nationalist party members in their own country. Whether that's Shabana Mahmood saying that, Islam is the driving force of everything I do in public life, and then conspicuously leaving Pakistan off of the list of countries that are punished for producing visa overstayers even when they're the most guilty culprits, whether or not it's all of the MPs from the Indian subcontinent constantly banging on about Islamophobia, or Priti Patel saying the Indians are living bridges and hey presto, we get 250,000 Indians every year. They all have loyalties elsewhere, Danny. You're not going to take those loyalties away from them because it's organic, it's sentimental, it's not rationally chosen. In very few instances do people break from their parents' culture, and that's usually like Muslim apostates that have been persecuted, or someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali that's abused by her own family. You're defining entire countries, categories of people, immigrants, entire ethnic groups, by the marginal exceptions. And I say, instead, we look at the majority, because that's a pretty reliable indicator of how people behave, and say, okay, if they behave that way in their country, do we want our country to turn into that country? And if not, we don't have them here.
Yes, it is an attempt at sort of enculturation, induction into Britishness, is to say, you are a citizen, this is what is expected of you. Obey the laws, but also respect the inheritance of our society. I also, of course, do recognise that there is a dimension to our identity which has nothing to do with our civic rights. It is about our belonging to, as you put it, a family, which extends through the generations, not just laterally. It extends, as it were, horizontally down from our distant ancestors. They give us...
I could have said that. That's something I could have said. So, if you are using basically my rhetoric, or the rhetoric of Bernie Yak in Nationalism and the Moral Psychology of Community, that nations are lateral and lineal structures. They are bound together by the lineal bonds of ancestry, and then the lateral bonds of cultural solidarity and in-group recognition. And if you break one of those, then you shatter it. It cannot just be the lateral or the lineal. If you recognize that, then why are you breaking the lineal bond by introducing completely other lineages into our lateral settlement?
It's a strong sense of who we are, and there is something about a nation which is for which the ethnos is relevant. So the sense of kinship. We are a community of relationship and of blood. How
we are a family of families. Yes. This is just recognizing reality. Brilliant. But then Danny is about to say, but there is this ethereal layer of liberal mysticism that sits atop that is supreme over those bonds of solidarity by kinship, by ancestry, by shared inheritance, that can kind of administrate those bonds of solidarity to be a second order effect, or largely irrelevant, because we can all rationally subscribe to this creed, or he says covenant, that means that we're all British. And it's like, I'm sorry, but the original Old Testament covenant, which is what Danny's referencing, is not even referencing the New Testament covenant of Christ, which would be a stronger case, even though the Bible doesn't eradicate differences between ethnic groups. The final verse of Gospel of Matthew is, "Go forth and be a minister to all nations," not deny national difference. But even if Danny was saying, okay, our new covenant is what St. Paul wrote in his epistles, there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor man nor woman, there is all one in Christ Jesus. No, he's saying it's like the Old Testament covenant. And I'm sorry, even Jesus comes from the line of descendants from Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, King David, right down to Jesus Christ. So it's by blood. And as James Orr put to Danny Kruger in their podcast, the only instance of being incorporated into that bloodline is by marriage. You've got Ruth the Moabite, who says, "Your people is my people, your God is my God, I will fight with you and I'll marry an Israelite." But even after marrying in, she's still Ruth the Moabite, she's not Ruth the Israelite. So she doesn't become English. So this entire conversation is just wrong-headed. But instead, I think it's because ultimately Danny just doesn't want to be called a racist. He says, I can acknowledge all of these facts of the matter. I can acknowledge that there are too many people in this country who do not consider themselves part of us. I can acknowledge that ethnicity is important. I can acknowledge that demographic change is something reasonable to be concerned about. But I'm not going to do anything about it because of my liberal ideology that I am emotionally committed to, because I fear the consequences of being disapproved of by the BBC and Sky News and The Guardian. will not allow me to do anything about it. And if you're not going to do anything about it, I will vote for the person who will.
However, and the great thing about, I think, the Western tradition and the English in particular is that our notion of the kinship is overlaid by this idea that we are related artificially, and that's what a covenant is. That's why I use that term. It comes from an ancient biblical concept of the artificial brotherhood.
All of your suppositions are based on stable demographic foundations that my generation and those, especially after me, have never known. Like, it's fine to talk about an artificial brotherhood of mutual consideration in politics or in civil society when you are 99.9% white British, which not only, at least at the last census, basically, Danny's constituency was, don't know about now, but given this attitude, I presume still is. But also, the country that he grew up in was that. So you can talk about this artificial brotherhood when you're talking at the level of political parties or football teams, or whether you're a northerner, or a southerner. But you can't talk about it when our country has become distinct and competing ethnic and religious tribes who do not share the same priors and therefore will not share any moral consideration between one another. There's no covenant to be had here, I'm afraid, because one side is not interested in buying into it, and the other side never asked for those antagonistic parties to be here.
By which we are related in the way that adopted siblings are related, even though there is no blood tie. But it is ultimately all held together by the inheritance of generations of people who've been born and died in these islands, and we should respect that greatly.
If those people were resurrected today and walked around Birmingham or Bradford or Leicester or Luton or London, would they think that you respected it greatly? Would they look kindly on you when you say, yeah, we understand this isn't what you wanted, but we're not going to do anything about it? I don't think they would.
To your suggestion, or your implied suggestion, Emma, that there should be some sort of privilege for people whose ancestors are from these islands over more recent immigrants or the children of more recent immigrants, I would contest that. I think that is the wrong way to approach our politics.
Emma didn't say that. Emma said, do you not feel that people feel as if they're having something important about their identity denied when you put their inheritance on the same plane of consideration and therefore access to political power and social services as someone from Afghanistan who arrived 5 minutes ago? Do you not feel that people might be annoyed about that because you are rescinding from them recognition and therefore you are denying them the primary claim over the only country that they've had, which has been bestowed to them by those ancestors that you say, Danny, we should respect the sacrifices of, we should respect the wishes of. So how is it respecting our ancestors by saying to them, your children do not have the primary claim over the country that you built, and instead we're going to give it away to Afghans? Please explain to me why that is the moral position, because you keep making moral declarations, but you don't substantiate any of them. You just go, oh, no, that's wrong, that's terrible, that's terrible, we can't possibly do that. Well, actually, no, we should, according to the parallel moral strain that runs alongside your liberalism in your own philosophy.
Except in the sense that I think in very local terms it might be appropriate, as we think about allocation, particularly of housing, to ensure that a local link is taken into account when we allocate housing. So in that quite limited sense of saying, if your family is from this place, then you should have you should have a advanced place in the queue for the allocation of public housing, social housing. I think that.
So, first of all, why should any immigrant be allowed social housing? Like, why should you be able to go over to a country and say, I want a free house at the taxpayer's expense? But also, you concede that there's something about rootedness that should be preserved. You're now in the bizarre situation, Danny, where you say, if I'm from Southeast London and I fall on hard times, and I go to the government and I say, sorry, I need temporary social housing, then I should be housed in the area that I was basically born in, within spitting distance of my primary school. because that's an important sense of rootedness of belonging we need to foster. But at the national level, nobody has any primary claim over this country, and Afghans are just as English as you. So on the local level, we have to prioritize you for your postcode, but we can't prioritize you as a people in the only country that you have, even though we say we have to honor the sacrifices of your ancestors who built the country. This is incoherent. And again, you've already conceded that there's a difference between demographics. You've already conceded that we have an obligation to honor the sacrifices of our ancestors. You've already conceded that belonging matters down to the street level, down to the borough level, down to the postcode level. But God forbid we draw a distinction between the English and the Afghans for who is more important in England.
That's an acceptable policy argument to make, and it's one that I would support in particular circumstances. But I think saying that there are different classes of citizen depending on your ancestry, I think that is dangerous.
Just for the record.
Emma's about to say she didn't say that, and yeah, she didn't. People aren't saying different classes of citizenship. They're saying, why are these people here and why were they handed citizenship in the first place? Because we do not have a New World citizenship system. We don't have a birthright citizenship. That was repealed in the 80s. It was a mistake to even have it in the first place. We have an inherited citizenship system, so you can gain British citizenship by birth. Or, if the civil service and a treacherous Tory government just rubber stamps it like a participation trophy, which was a great mistake. So you have got two models of citizenship currently operating in Britain, handing out like confetti, or having inherited it from your ancestors. And all of these obligations to one's ancestors that Danny recognises are right, and I agree with him, are in complete contradiction to his assertion that citizenship is some kind of sacred right when handed out by the government. Which, I mean, that's not even how the Americans thought of it as the original founding fathers. They thought, originally, citizenship should only be given to a free white person of good moral character. Nevertheless, this is kind of like a modern American conception that citizenship is sacred, just because it's been given out. No. These people should never have been brought here in the first place. They shouldn't have been given citizenship. And so the root question is not, well, should there be two tiers of citizenship? It should be, why should they have citizenship? Why were these people brought here by the government that you were a part of, Danny? At the very least as a backbench MP trying to agitate them towards what I think was a better direction with Miriam Cates and the New Conservatives. Don't get me wrong, I think Danny was on the right side of that issue. I just think he is insufficiently courageous and philosophically incoherent. Why should those people be here? Why should they have citizenship? We have the precedent to take it away. Shabana Mahmood has just done it to an ethnically English guy and left him stranded in Russia because he fancied a Russian bird and he kept going on police officer exchange programs that our government were happy to do, by the way, with the Russians. Like, she's just stranded an Englishman out in Russia with a backroom hearing and has not disclosed the reason other than his presence in our country is no longer conducive to the public good. It's the same with Shamim Begum. It could be the same with El Fattah, the Egyptian terror sympathiser that Keir Starmer celebrated bringing over here, gave him British citizenship because his mother was an anchor baby in Britain, and he has never been to Britain, but he inherited his citizenship via her, which is absolutely absurd. In that case, not inherited citizenship. All of Reform agree he should be stripped of his citizenship and deported back to Egypt. So why can't we do that to all of the Afghans, for example, that were brought here against the wishes of the public, without their knowledge, which Robert Jenrick was celebrating, and have now raped and killed people? Why can't we do that with all the Pakistani grooming gang perpetrators? Why can't we do that to restore the value of citizenship to be one which honours our ancestors' sacrifices, Daddy? Questions never answered.
Record, that isn't what I was. I wasn't arguing that's precisely what we should do. I was thinking more in terms of that people feel that their ethnicity in some way is being denied. To say that that somebody who comes here and is a first generation migrant is an equal heir. That some people may feel that that is undermining their own sense of self.
Well, it depends what they mean, what they want. I mean, if they want privileged access to public services, or that people who've been born here with different ethnic ancestry should have a lower status in our country, then I would disagree, I'm sure.
Not everything is about your interactions with state bureaucracy. What we want is primary consideration, recognition from a political party that is purportedly speaking in our interests. No, I don't think that's the case, because Reform are running the actual Boris wave as their candidates at the local council elections. And they seem more than happy to pander to every other ethnic and religious group, the hypothetical moderate Muslim vote, Matt Goodwin hugging a Sikh in Gorton and Denton, Danny Kruger brings up anti-Semitism before hatred of the English. He doesn't even bring up anti-white racism as a concern in this interview. What people want is to be considered, to be at the foremost of your mind, to be the people in whose interest you are acting, to be your pre-political we. That's what people want. They're not saying that people of other ethnic heritage should be denied NHS treatment. What they're saying is immigrants should not be able to come over and claim public services or stand for public office and exploit the taxpayer and use our political system to advantage their ethnic diaspora or their home country. That's a perfectly reasonable demand. That's how a functioning country does things. We're just insane and allow ourselves to be exploited because of liberalism, something that Danny remains ideologically committed to. What people are saying is, please think of us. Please care about us. Please be for the British people. Not the British people and, not the British people maybe, not the British people sometimes, us. Think about us. And you're not willing to do that. So they're going to vote for the person that does.
I presume you don't think that either. So I think that is a dangerous line to take. I know it is popular in parts of the internet, but I think it's a line we absolutely need to police.
Danny Kruger is in the business of tone policing your opinions of minorities. What is the point of Reform? And I don't want to say that. Seriously, I don't. Because there are still good people there. But this is just another colour of the establishment. It's just inadequate.
I mean, I want to pay full acknowledgement to the argument that people feel their country is being taken from them. That the rate of immigration has been way too high. That we have millions of people who don't meaningfully belong to our country, who yet are citizens and living here. They don't belong in the sense of having a genuine connection with their neighbours outside their particular immigrant community.
Yes. All of this contradicts what you were saying earlier. Hence why, under the weight of cognitive dissonance, he's going to say, but they should remain citizens.
And they don't necessarily have a meaningful sense of obligation and belonging and allegiance here. That is a major problem. But the answer is not to strip them of their rights.
So they're going to be here forever. The answer is not consequences for not belonging to our country, for hating us, for taking advantage of us. Oh, the answer couldn't possibly be to send them back to the countries they came from before they became our problem. The Reform position is, now, according to Danny Kruger, it might change tomorrow, depending on what side of the bed Nigel Farage wakes up on, but the Reform position is, according to Danny Kruger, demographic change is a concern, cultural erasure will render Britain unrecognisable. Yes, there are some people that don't belong here, but because we have brought them here and given them citizenship, we can't possibly take it away. That would be too mean, so you're stuck with them forever. What's the point? Just totally insufficient.
It's to insist that they honour them.
What do you think would be the solution to deal with those communities that opt to remain segregated? Because liberalism has always had a difficult time in even in enforcing itself in some sense, or privileging the creed of liberalism. That's something that the British state has found difficult. All of the sort of David Cameron's talk of muscular liberalism and whatnot was a sort of symptom of that.
Yeah, that worked really well, didn't it? Also, David Cameron, gerrymandered the Conservative Party via DEI and then bragged about it in the Times in 2022, saying we were all white men, so I decided to do something about it. Bear in mind, Danny Kruger wrote the Hug a Hoodie speech for David Cameron and recently defended it. So Danny Kruger is just recycled Cameron Toryism in a teal rosette, unfortunately.
What do you do with those who are British citizens but just simply refuse to integrate over time? Because, of course, you've had, I know that you've spoken yourself about cousin marriage, for example.
Well, partly it does come back to the question of scale, because, as Brits, as liberals, we should tolerate people who want to live apart. I mean,
I'm not a liberal, so I don't tolerate it. No. And all of Danny's conception of these communities that want to live apart are all alien to our traditions for over 1,000 years. Like, we have had more immigration since 1997 than between the Battle of Hastings and World War II, 1066 and 1945. So this has been a anachronistic period of liberal delusion that has wreaked untold horrors on our population. It's been a mistake. We should admit it's been a mistake. We should reverse it. But instead, Danny, out of ideological commitment to liberalism, says, well, no, we have to sort of let them crack on with it. Even though he admits that this is a problem, he goes, this is where the ideology just suddenly intercedes and stops the common sense, the recognition of reality. Ideology swoops in and saves him from making a reasonable conclusion, and it says, but I'm already committed ahead of time to live and let live, and so we have to let these people live in our country and create little colonies that send off our money and remittances and worship their foreign religions and continue reproducing and rendering us a minority, even though I've said that's going to be a problem. Pointless.
I mean, we shouldn't enforce conviviality on anybody, and there are communities, religious communities particularly in the UK, which for their own reasons, which we might regard as eccentric, but do no harm to anybody, live in a very isolated sense. The problem is when you have that on a mass scale, when you have whole towns, cities living separately, and also, I'm afraid to say, living in ways that we do not regard as conducive to the well-being of the individuals themselves. So,
yeah, so now we've got to concern ourselves with the moral well-being of the people that have been brought here into our country at our expense, are living at our expense, and probably don't hold us in high regard. I don't think there's a lot of reciprocal concern about our welfare, given the way that they live and take advantage of the taxpayer. But also, okay, you admit that this has already happened. You admit this is a problem. You admit that our towns and cities have been terraformed over the last few decades. Again, you don't want to do anything about it because you think that would profane your ideology, which gives you a sense of unearned moral superiority.
You know, having models of family and community life that are not just separate, but are actually, you know, deeply harmful to the members, the vulnerable people within those groups. So I think it is appropriate to challenge that. How do we deal with it? Well, partly it is, again, about numbers. It's about reducing the inflow, and I think we need to do a lot more about stopping the chain migration, the model of marriage that brings successive generations of people into this country who don't speak English and who don't have a sense of belonging to our nation.
Just a side point as I'm watching this, doesn't it seem that everything he's saying is strained? That he's trying to search for the right words because he's afraid of saying the wrong thing, because he's trying to walk a very thin line of, well, we have to sand off the excesses which offend liberalism about these communities. He's only speaking about Islam here, but I mean, like, I don't want the railway signs in Southall and other stations on the Elizabeth line to be in Hindi or Punjabi. I don't want pan spat everywhere, all over Wembley and other Hindu and Sikh enclaves. You know, Indians as an ethnic group are the single largest producer of sex offenders. Not per capita, but single largest nation that produces sex offenders. So I don't want any of this, and I can say it pretty clearly. But Danny is stumbling over his words because he still cares about causing offence to random communities and being called a bigot. Sorry, we just have to adopt the posture at this point of, I don't care what names you call me, I'm going to recognise reality, because being dispossessed of my country and disgracing my descendants matters more than the mean names that you call me, because those mean names have enabled atrocities to go on for the last few decades, and we're just not going to let them go on anymore.
We need to be much more deliberate about the way we deploy the powers of the state over education, over culture. We should be much more robust in policing what is taught and preached in mosques.
So you're going to create basically a surveillance state despite shrinking the size of the state and the civil service, because you're a small government liberal, you want a massive surveillance state to police the thoughts and the behaviour of these communities and try to play umpire between minorities and majorities. You want, basically, the Hobbesian Leviathan. You want the Michaela School on a national scale. And you want to, and it's not going to work, see my debate with Catherine Burbelsing as to why, I'll link it down in the description, but you want to brainwash, essentially, the children of immigrants into cosplaying as Brits. No. It's not going to work. It will be done using my tax money. It will be done against my consent and the consent of the majority of the electorate. And it's not going to reproduce Britain at the end of it because it's not going to be the same people, the same families, the same lineage that runs through the country. There's going to be a sharp disjunction, which is then going to disrupt the lateral bonds of solidarity because those are done not on a rational, conscious level. They're not done by signing up to a Scouts pledge or just really learning a culture really deeply. What Danny's asking is for you to love someone else's children as if they're your own, and I'm sorry, just most people don't do that. And again, this is a question that never gets answered by these sort of civic nationalists. What is a baby before they learn to love their own history and heritage and culture? Is it without nationality? Is it without ethnicity? Is it without identity? No, because you could only ever be born to your parents. There's not this sort of cosmic waiting room where I could have had the misfortune of being born Indian. I was always going to be English. I've always been English. And even if I become a spiteful communist like Keir Starmer tomorrow, I will still be English. I'll just be called a traitor because we recognise that I should have loyalty to my in-group, which I've inherited, and I have betrayed it. I'm not a traitor to India because I'm not Indian. Very, very frustrating.
And who gets to preach here? Arab countries do not have the same liberal attitude that we do to the sort of management and the regulation of preaching. So I think there's a bunch of stuff we can do, as it were, top down. We can enforce the law, particularly on marriage. I think we need to look at the registration of marriages.
Carl Benjamin actually beat me to doing a live stream about this last night, even though I was sort of clipping it endlessly on X. And as he pointed out, so what are you going to do? Just audit the mosques? Like, you're going to send a person in a high-vis vest and a clipboard from the council around to every mosque, presumably who speaks Arabic, because we've got an abundance of translators. Maybe they have like a little AI earpiece just going through the sermon, and they're just going to be ticking off the contents of the sermon on a form, going, oh, that transgresses liberalism, that's not very inclusive of LGBT ideology, we're going to fine this mosque. It's like, what? It would just be way easier to just turn every mosque into a Wetherspoons. Like, there just shouldn't be mosques in Britain. Sorry. Like, it doesn't mean we go door to door persecuting people for the private thoughts in their head, because that's not a very English thing to do. I agree. But we just shouldn't have brought these people into our country who believe in a completely different civilization, who have different ethnic solidarities than our own. And then we shouldn't be compelled to adapt to this change that we never wanted in the vague hope that your wishful thinking will succeed. Especially when you want to shrink the size of the state and its budget. And Nigel Farage has already said to Jordan Peterson, prior to, 2024 election, so who knows if he still believes that anymore, that reform shouldn't be recognising these sort of differences between communities and playing favourites between blacks and whites. Actually, he definitely doesn't believe that now because he thinks we should appease Islam, otherwise we will lose by 2050. But also, hang on, how is this appeasing Islam? As Emma will later say, wouldn't this be considered Islamophobic because you are actually treating Muslims as different to Christians? Because you're presumably not going to use the force of the state to police what is said in Christian churches because you know that doesn't produce suicide bombers and child rapists. So, weirdly enough, Danny is actually drawing distinctions between the types of citizen in this country based on their religion, and presumably their ethnicity as well, because aside from a few gingers, there aren't many white Muslims. Except for Albanians, but that's a bit dicey. And your average church-going Christian from Devizes. Danny recognises the difference, and he's actually saying that the state has to play umpire to mediate that difference, but then also says, well, we can't be bigoted and say that Afghans can't become English. It's incoherent, totally incoherent. This was a car crash of an interview. And I'm sorry to Danny's staff, who are, again, nice people, but this is not defensible. It's just gobbledygook to try and stay within the safe and comfortable domain of not getting called a racist by ITV.
To look at the whole economy of some of these communities, which are held together by systems of fees and often managed through charities, which I think we need to look quite closely at. So there's an economy, there's an infrastructure there we should address.
We should just ban it. Like, there shouldn't be a single faith-based charity that isn't Christian, because we're a Christian country. We shouldn't be spending all this money on random charities anyway. You do know the charitable purpose defined, I think it was in the 2006 Charity Act, but it was kept on the books by Cameron's Conservative Party in 2011 at the very least. One of them is for pursuing community cohesion, religious pluralism, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the government, unless Charity Act is repealed by a reform government, is going to be spending money on DEI, and is going to spend money on the mosques, despite them being the epicenters of radicalization, according to Danny Kruger's own philosophy. They just shouldn't be here. It's way easier if they just aren't here. We don't have to spend all this time and energy arguing with each other and working out how to try and contain this problem if the problem just isn't here.
And we need to be absolutely adamant that anybody who is actively promulgating anti-Semitism or anti-Western extremism, that is unacceptable, and we should use the law to crack down very hard on that, including using powers of deportation.
So, if you're mean to Jews, we'll deport you, but not for anything else. Like, seriously, this is why people are so annoyed, because anti-Semitism is put before anti-Western sentiment, which is very, very vague, whereas anti-Semitism was quite, concrete. They hate Jews and want them dead. Okay. Notice how hating English people, the British, wasn't mentioned in there. Because that would be my primary... That's what Rupert says all the time. If they hate us and our way of life. By us, he means the British people. He's speaking about a pre-political we there. He's saying, I am one of you, I am on your side, these people aren't, and I'm going to act in your interest against them. What Danny is saying is, if they have a negative opinion of Jews, if presumably they don't observe the Sabbath, we're going to deport you. Dear God. What are you going to do? Are you going to stand at the passport gates and ask them what their opinion on various verses from the Old Testament are? How are you going to enforce this? As Carl said, are you going to audit the entire Muslim community with a shrunken state? This isn't going to work. Logistically, it's philosophically incoherent. We just can't keep pursuing this path because it will lead to our ruin. It already has. This is just more of the same.
For people who clearly should not be in our country, influencing young people to hate the West.
Nigel had previously said that that Reform didn't want to politically alienate Islam. I think some Muslims would argue that what you have just described would be alienating. There are definitely some people who would say that what you've just described there is Islamophobic, that it's interfering with their religious liberty.
Yes. Emma's brilliant in this, by the way. I haven't seen enough supportive comments of Emma on this interview. It hasn't got that many views, actually. So despite Danny's insanity, tell Emma she did a good job.
How would you respond to that?
Listen, I have a great respect for many Muslims in our public life. People I know privately. I have absolutely no objection to Muslims, and
Then what the fuck is the point? What is the point? Oh, demographic changes are really dangerous. Oh, if we become an Islamic country, we won't be the same. Oh, the Islamic family is terrible for women and girls. I love Islam. Islam's great. I have such great respect for Islam. Please don't call me a racist. It's cowardly. No, I don't respect Islam. Islam is terrible. It's awful. It says, do not befriend Christians and Jews. Strike at the necks of unbelievers. It says, commit genocide against Jews in order to bring about Judgment Day. And then when Judgment Day happens, Christ himself will come back and tell all the Christians to submit to Allah, break his cross, abolish the jizya, and say, psych, the Bible was a lie. Muhammad, let's not even get into the depraved moral character of who Muslims think is a prophet and the perfect man, or just the contradictions in the text, or the 1,000 years of Islamic history, about 1,300, of just conquest and slavery and rape. No, I don't respect Islam. There might be a few people who, incidentally, have good moral character, despite being a Muslim, despite coming from a different tradition. I've met a couple. But that doesn't make Islam worthy of respect. That doesn't mean most Muslims are good people. And it doesn't mean Islam being in Britain is conducive to our public good, or is in keeping with our traditions. It doesn't mean we should accommodate it. In fact, I think it should never have been brought here in the first place, and should be discouraged and expelled.
As a man of faith, I respect people who believe in God and who live out their faith in their lives. That's a good thing for our society to have people who are religious.
Yeah, it's a good thing for people to be religious. Which religion? Oh, I couldn't possibly draw a qualitative distinction between religions. I'm a man of God. Which God? Well, not Vishnu, not Allah. So you do actually draw a qualitative distinction because you're not a Muslim, Danny. So you do know the difference between the doctrine. Clearly you don't find it persuasive. So you do actually state the supremacy of Christianity. Oh, actually, well, later on he says Christianity is great because it's an umbrella for other faiths. So it just, like, liberalism. He's just, he is religiously committed to liberalism, not Christianity. But I might remind Danny of the Gospel of John, chapter 14, where Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. Christianity is mutually exclusive to other religions, and so you can't actually have a great deal of respect for other religions. You can be interested in their traditions, but you can't recognize the truth claims they make as compatible with Christianity, because the claim that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, he was born of a virgin, he died, was buried, resurrected, and will come again on the day of judgment, so we can all sing with heavenly hosts in heaven. Hopefully I've summarized that accurately. You can't say that that is compatible with, well, you know, if you commit suicide bombing, you'll go to heaven, you'll get 72 virgins, and you might have the luck of seeing Allah's shin. Come on, Danny. This is just weak. It's more of the same.
And it's not for me to determine which religion is right or wrong. I've got my preference, obviously, and I disagree with people who have a different faith, but they disagree with me, and that's in a society of religious pluralism, that should be acceptable.
They don't agree with religious pluralism. Name a Muslim country where Christianity is thriving. Okay, excellent. Glad we've cleared that up. So no, they don't agree with your Protestant priors. They don't agree with your liberalism. And so, if you allow their religion to proliferate, if you bring these people into our country and allow them to live apart, as you say, then they will eventually swamp our country. It will become the majority culture, the majority population, and your liberalism will go extinct.
So I do not have any objection to Muslims. And insofar as I'm concerned about Islam, it's not in its religious principles; it's in its political manifestation or political.
It's the same book. It's the same hadiths. It's the same tradition. Where do you think they get their political imperatives from, if not their religious convictions? Where do you think they get their values from, if not the religion? Religion and values are not distinct. Values come from religion. Religions often come from tribes. I mean, literally. Islam mapped onto the tribal arrangements of 7th century Arabia. It's why they incorporated bits of the Jewish and Christian tradition to try and convince the tribes in Medina and the Christians in what was 7th century Syria to convert at either the point of the sword or using the Shahada. If you didn't recite the Shahada, you became a martyr for your own faith, as Muhammad's treatment of Jews at Khaybar seems to prove. So this false distinction between political Islam or Islamism and true Islam, hypothetical moderate Islam, one, puts you in the sticky situation of saying, was Muhammad himself an Islamist? But two, it just betrays that you actually don't know much about the topic you're talking about, or you do, and you're just lying to avoid being called mean names. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to indulge in politically correct, pseudo-polite fictions when my country is on the precipice of being dissolved by demographic replacement.
Islam, and certainly Islamism, which preaches the doctrine that the world must be suborned to Islam by force or by deception. So,
okay. I would worry about the deception part, considering there are Muslims leading reform, though I don't think they're that devout, to be honest. But the only difference between Shias and Sunnis is not whether or not there should be a global caliphate, but who gets to lead it. Whether or not it's a sort of divinely inspired political appointee, like a Muslim pope, or whether or not it's the reincarnated descendant of Muhammad Ali, not Muhammad Ali, as in like Ali, the descendant of Muhammad, who was robbed of the chance in this brutal massacre when he tried to challenge the sitting caliph and was killed for his trouble. So they don't disagree whether or not they want a centralized political Muslim authority. There is no separation of mosque and state. They just disagree on who they want to lead it. But all the denominations agree that it's not you. They all agree that Christians should live as dhimmis, as second-class citizens, under the jizya, or if they're not willing to, and some Muslims won't let them, if they're not willing to convert, they will be killed. So let's not go down this line, Danny. There is no distinction between political Islam and Islamism and Islam proper. And we shouldn't gamble our entire civilization on the hope that Muslims that your government brought into this country don't read their own book too closely.
I don't think we should be afraid of making these arguments. I think we do need to be very respectful of individual Muslims, and Nigel is absolutely right. We don't want to pick a fight with a religion, certainly not a religious group.
By the way, when they polled various ethnic and religious groups, Muslims were the least likely to vote for reform. So this pursuit of the moderate Muslim vote, something which Majid Nawaz has said Nigel can win, just again more delusion, just absolute cope flowing out of reform these days. And we don't have time for it. Like, I'm sorry to be this harsh. We do not have time for this.
But I think we can't shy away from the fact that that Islam and Islamic institutions in our country are providing a cover for both extremist propaganda and also for the way of living, this segregated way of life that is bad for our society as a whole, and I think bad for the people in that community as well. So, I hope it's not just me being a kind of frightened liberal that I'm scared of, picking on Islam and Muslims, because I genuinely don't want to. I genuinely.
So yes, you are a frightened liberal. You are. If you refuse to proscribe certain viewpoints that are incompatible with your own, then you cannot guarantee your own liberalism, and instead you are putting your desire not to be called names and to feel uncomfortable over the future of the country and the obligations to our ancestors that you said we have to honour, but you're not going to do it in any substantive way. So yes, you are just a frightened liberal.
Genuinely respect. There's a bunch of MPs in the House of Commons who I have great respect for. We have Muslims, of course, in the leadership of Reform.
Yeah, great idea. It's worked out well, hasn't it?
And there are people, as I say, in Parliament. My friend Naz Shah, a Labour MP, got a great deal of respect for.
It's at this point where lots of people in the comments just went, okay, I knew Danny's judgment was worth nothing. Naz Shah, if you remember in 2017, liked and retweeted an Owen Jones parody account that said, those raped girls in Rotherham, or those abused girls in Rotherham, should shut their mouths for the good of diversity. She since insists that she is the victim of this. So, if you think that Naz Shah is someone worthy of respect, then your line for the kind of Islam and people that belong in Britain, Danny, it's not worth anything. Truly, it's just astounding.
Just brought out a book actually about her, about the culture of the community that she grew up in, Pakistani, British.
Not British, Pakistani. Yeah, she explains how Izzat, so sort of face-saving, collectivist, honour-based shame culture, stopped her mother from speaking out about the violent and sexual abuse that she, Naz, and her sister all faced at the hands of their father, who ran off with like an underage neighbour, and then their drug-dealing boyfriend, who then the mother had to kill and went to prison for killing, and never admitted that she did it in defence of her daughters. So that's an absolute horror story enabled by Pakistani culture, and it's common across the Indian subcontinent. I don't want that here, it shouldn't be here. And if Naz Shah recognises that's atrocious, then why does she want to promulgate it with more Pakistani immigration? Why do you want to promulgate it by keeping these people here, Danny, if you recognise it's horrible?
Very, very serious concerns there. But she's brilliant. And I am not going to start identifying either individual British Muslims, let alone Islam as a whole. But I do think we have a problem. And I think
I'm not going to start identifying individual British Muslims as a problem, but if they're anti-Semitic, they should be deported. What the fuck are you on about?
it's right to say it without being bullied by accusations of Islamophobia.
Do you think then that it's unreasonable for people to be concerned about the increasing prominence of Islam in public, sort of particularly during Ramadan? We've seen a lot of public assertions of Islam in the public space, people praying in public, that kind of thing. Do you think it's unreasonable for people to be concerned about that and concerned about the increasing prominence of Islam within our politics? I'm thinking of the Gorton and Denton by-election, for example.
Well, in Gorton and Denton, you had another problem, which is I don't think religious. It's to do with the clans that operate this family voting system. I mean,
You have just said that the religion causes a repressive environment for the women and children trapped in these families. And then you said, but it's nothing to do with religion, it's the clans. Danny, this is why I know that you haven't really read anything about Islam. In the Quran, there is a verse that says allegiance with the Ummah, with Allah, does not supersede the blood bonds between believers. Because it was mapping onto a tribal system in 7th century Arabia that was dictated by clustering around scarce water sources. And this is why, as well as Muhammad marrying, I think it's his 7th wife, his cousin, this is why cousin marriage is prolific across the entire Muslim world and in the Biradiri clans that have been imported via Pakistan and Bangladesh into our country. And you know this because you yourself have said cousin marriage is a problem, and it comes from Islam as well as the clan structure which predated and is symbiotically reinforced by Islamic scripture. Also, again, the insane belief in reform that you're going to win this moderate Muslim vote. Is your hypothesis really that a bunch of Muslim women were desperate to vote for Matt Goodwin but were told not to by their husbands on polling day? If so, again, you are too deluded to be allowed to push buttons that actually connect to anything important.
that is deeply problematic. In terms of the display of Islam in public life, well, insofar as what you're actually seeing there is a assertion of a sort of political claim to say this is our territory, this neighborhood, this is a Muslim neighborhood. I think that's certainly worrying, and we should be concerned about it. But I think we need to focus our attention on where we have bad politics, not where we have bad religion. And
you can't separate the two. Islam is a political doctrine. The doctrine of conquest.
And when you see groups insisting that when what's actually happening is a sort of claim of territory on behalf of a political model, and there might be Palestinian flags or others signalling what's going on there, then yes, I share the concern. But
I share the concern, but God forbid we actually do anything about it.
I mean, I don't want to clamp down on religious symbolism or practice. I mean, if people want to pray in public, that should be totally fine.
To what? To what? And so, here's the thing, Danny. Here's a test case. In the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, Muslims gathered outside Downing Street and did a public prayer. That was a show of dominance. That was a celebration of the October the 7th massacre. Now, Danny Kruger has attended, I think it was lined up to speak, an unheard event about why conservatives should support Israel. He's already said here that anti-Semitism is a prime concern over anti-Western hatred, and without even mentioning anti-white or anti-British hatred. And he went on Newsnight in the aftermath of Bob Vylan speaking at Glastonbury when he chanted death, death to the IDF, and he said that's absolutely reprehensible. Didn't mention the fact that Bob Vylan said, heard you want your country back, to the gammons, the white working class who are actually voting reform, nuh-uh, shut the F up. So, of course, Jewish people, anti-Semitism, very prominent concern in Danny Kruger's mind. Fine, you're emotionally attached to that. You should also be emotionally attached to the British people but you seem to think that Afghans can just graft themselves into that, so whatever. Do you not think that that public prayer is a show of dominance over Jews and Britain in the immediate aftermath of a mass Jewish massacre, Danny? If so, should they be allowed to pray in public? No? Okay, so we agree that what they're doing by praying in public and what Christians are doing by praying in public silently outside abortion centres are qualitatively different. Theirs is a display of dominance, a foreign culture, civilization, and political doctrine being projected onto our own. It's a flex of force, whereas the other one is a Christian being persecuted for mourning the murder of an unborn child. So we can discriminate against them using our prudence, rather than just existing in this ethereal, universal layer of liberal abstractions that can't guarantee the foundations upon which it rests, which is a demographic, security, high-trust society, and the shared assumption that there is a public-private distinction that is particular to Protestantism on the European continent and in England to separate different denominations of Christianity, not Hindus and Sikhs and Jews and Muslims and... Not going to work, Danny.
But I understand why people are concerned. And it does come down to scale. I mean, you know, a few Pentecostal Christians doing that isn't going to bother anybody because the numbers are so low in practice.
No, it's because they don't commit suicide bombings. Right? If people hear Allahu Akbar in the middle of the street, they're going to run. If they hear Christ is King, they're going to turn around and go, all right, keep it down, mate. Qualitative difference. And if you're not an ideological liberal that believes basically in the blank slate, even though you don't say that you do, even though you admit demographic change is a concern, if you're not an ideological liberal, you can draw these distinctions. So we have to jettison liberalism. We have to jettison, unfortunately, if this is the driving philosophy of reform, because remember, Danny Kruger is the philosophical brain trust of reform, we just can't vote for reform.
When you have large numbers of people doing it, I think that's what worries people.
Briefly, before moving on to how Reform are preparing for government, given what you were saying earlier about the way that Reform would be willing to tackle certain things, like you mentioned, Islamic marriages, Sharia courts, that kind of thing, and Islamism, are Reform willing to be regarded or accused of Islamophobia by more extreme parts of the Muslim community?
Well, I think we are constantly accused of Islamophobia, we're accused of racism, we're accused of all sorts. So,
and yet you still let it get to you.
yeah, I mean, as I've said, we need to be respectful of individual Muslims, indifferent to Islam as a religion, because we're in a plural society where you can believe what you like.
Why should we be indifferent to Islam as a religion? Like, why, even if you're insisting on religious pluralism, why are you compelled to have a neutral position on Islam? Or even a positive one? Because you have a positive position about Islam, saying it's actually a good thing for people to be religious, no matter their religion. Why are you compelled to not have a negative characterization about Islam? This is the issue. Because you already have said there are undesirable qualities about the Islamic family structure, about political Islam, all derived from Islam proper, which again, I presume Danny hasn't done much reading into, because he wouldn't speak about it this way if he had. But why are you compelled to have a neutral stance? Which is not a neutral stance, because if you're compelled to have a stance, it's not neutral. It's affirmative. So again, philosophically incoherent. Why are you compelled to treat every religion as if they have equal worth, even in a pluralistic society? Because tolerance means you put up with it. It does not mean you don't tolerate ice cream for dinner, right? What you tolerate is going to the dentist. You tolerate the pain of your stubbed toe. So what you're saying is we should be tolerant of other faiths, which means we start from the position of disagreeing with them and looking qualitatively down on them, but we privilege this belief in tolerance above making qualitative distinctions. Actually, I don't, because having made qualitative distinctions based on the behaviour of the people that believe in these faiths, I see that they're all inferior to the civilization that Christianity built in England. And so, they just shouldn't be here.
But concerned about about what we might call political Islam or Islamism, certainly concerned about the social practice that goes on under the umbrella of Islam, and not be afraid being accused of phobias and racism because of that. So that's the reason we had the grooming gangs scandal, and the reason why so many young people have been radicalised by foreign preachers and what they see online is because society as a whole has been too scared to say, no, in Britain, we don't believe that stuff.
That's not why it happened. It happened because they're here. It happens wherever they go. So no, it's not happened just because we haven't said strongly enough, well, that's awfully inconsiderate of you, Jap. It's happened because you've allowed them to come here and live as they would like to live. Because they don't consider themselves as one of us, and they don't consider us to have equal moral consideration to them, but you are affording it to them, refusing to punish them when they don't reciprocate, and so you're leaving us vulnerable to exploitation with your liberalism.
We believe this, which is that everybody is equal. Everybody has equal value and dignity, whatever their beliefs. And certainly,
they don't. And also, no, not everyone is equal, no matter what their beliefs are. I don't think Axel Rudikabana is equal to me, because he believes white children should be stabbed to death, and he glorifies in the fact that his youngest was 6. That man is not equal to me. If you keep saying that, the word equal means nothing, Danny. And no, you might say, we all have the capacity, the equal capacity, to manifest moral dignity per Christian doctrine. It doesn't mean everyone does it. And then, it's absurd to say, everyone is equal based on race and also religion and belief. Like, okay, everyone's equal based on immutable characteristic and whatever they choose to feel in any given moment in any given day. And also, by the way, you can just choose to change that at any time because Afghans can become English. None of this makes sense. It's all platitudes said in the comfort of a studio, then returning to a very ethnically homogeneous, high-trust constituency in the southwest of England where you don't ever face the consequences of your own actions. I'm sorry, loads of us are living at the coalface of it. Our experience of diversity is not, oh, our interesting, barely Muslim friend who we sit next to at a dinner party and yap about interesting tidbits of history. Like, a lot of people's experience is, being beaten up by a black gang at school, or girls being sold like a slave auction in children's homes by Pakistani drug traffickers. So, time for this talk is long gone.
Whatever their ethnic background or their national background. So these are the principles of Britishness, and we expect you to conform to them.
The principles of Britishness is diversity is our strength. Vote reform. For sake of time, I'm going to skip the conversation about civil service reform that happens between 20 and 29 minutes, because in this podcast and the previous podcast with The Spectator, Danny Kruger said that they're finally going to revise the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, which means they can hire and fire civil servants and replace them with a bunch of bright young sparks that they were recently seen on a retreat with. And look, on the constitutional questions, James Orr, Danny Kruger, David Starkey, they're all very sound. But on the philosophical underwriting of those constitutional questions, as Danny Kruger has shown here, they're just weak. If you can't draw qualitative... But on the philosophical underpinnings of those constitutional changes, they're weak. Because if you can't draw qualitative distinctions between religions and peoples and national backgrounds, then you're still going to have ideological activists trying to advance the interests of their ethnic in-group or their nation of origin or Islam in the Home Office. You're still going to have people being recalcitrant by a matter of personal agenda or habit to investigate Islamic extremism on Prevent. You're still going to have people pushing from within the Home Office to not prescribe certain countries on an immigration red list because they come from there and they don't want to be shunned at the family iftar. So I'm sorry, again, this is all just weak.
Absorbed by the blob. What do you say to those who accuse reform of just becoming part of the uniparty?
Well, listen, there's always going to be people who are so purist that they see any sort of concession to reality, any sense in which we have to work with what we've got, and or acknowledgement that some things that previous governments or the current system do are worth saving. I mean, we're not going to be scorched earth Leninists who want to just dismantle and demolish everything and build a new country based on our own, brilliant minds. I mean, that is...
Okay, but you're more ideological than I am because you're an ideological liberal and I'm just dealing with facts as they are. And so what he's saying here is that reform is going to keep the apparatus of the establishment in place. They're just going to change out some of the personnel, but they're going to keep the ideology of Cameronite conservatism, which is actually just Blairism, in place, as Danny Kruger has showed here, which means that the people they select to do the job will also be of the same thinking. So it'll just be a changing of the guard for the establishment. And if you object to this, well, you're just purity spiraling. You're not realistic. You must be a communist. I mean, it's just such a bad faith straw man. No. Accountability for what's been done to us is not a purity spiral. Wanting an authentic alternative to the establishment that has caused all these problems, and like you, Danny, refuses to do anything about them, is not being unrealistic. It's a reasonable demand, and lots of people think they're making it by voting reform. But I think the more people see this, they'll realise that reform isn't the party that they think they're voting for.
There'll be some, as I say, who will never be satisfied until they see us in a beret with a kind of AK-47 over our shoulders and a commitment to take out and shoot every member of the civil service. We're not going to do that.
You've mentioned illegal migration and deporting people who shouldn't be here, have no right to be here. But what about legal migration? How are you going to turn back the tide of the sort of demographic? We're heading towards a demographic precipice. People are very unhappy about the situation. A YouGov poll showed that 32% of the country think that we're on the road to civil war. How is reform going to deal with the issue of legal as well as legal migration, but also the issue of sectarianism?
Great question from Emma. How is reform going to deal with all of the problems that we've already admitted in the first half of this interview are problems? What does Danny say?
Well, let me just deal with the question of threat of civil war. I mean, I've said that I worry that if reform doesn't win, or if we win and don't deliver, I do worry about our country and the potential for civil unrest. I mean, I think we already see flashpoints of that at the moment. And
let's remove the combatants then, Danny, so that there is no war between two hostile sides.
The key imperative for our country is to get a government that understands the scale of public distress about migration, about segregation, about the breakdown of our cultural norms, and is clearly committed to addressing those issues. So I think the way to avoid civil unrest is to have a reform government that addresses its causes. What we do about legal migration, well, we will have a far stricter visa regime. We're not going to have people coming into this country who can't speak English, who don't earn their own way, who don't make a contribution to our country. We're going to be very explicit about the requirements for a visa to come and live here.
And what about the ones that are already here?
And in terms of you describe the demographic reality, well, the two responses to that. One is to ensure that people who are born here, whatever ethnicity they're from, whatever their family background, they genuinely grow up as little Brits.
What the fuck? The time for this conversation was about 30 years ago, and even then it wouldn't have worked. Yes, demographic change is a problem. Yes, they're living in sequestered sectarian enclaves. Yes, they might hate us, or at the very least they hate Jews. But we're going to teach them to become little Brits. This is absurd. This is just absurd. You can see why I was so frustrated, why I had to do a video on this. This is the most delusional interview I think I've ever watched. It's the second most damaging interview I've ever watched, except for Farage's interview with Stephen Edgington, where he said, we're not going to do mass deportations. This is shocking.
And we have to be very explicit about that mission. And it's not going to be easy or instant. But I am hopeful that we can do it if we set the clear cultural expectations for what it is to belong to this country.
I don't care if you're hopeful, Danny, and your cultural expectations for belonging to this country is to have a religion, doesn't matter what religion, to respect the rule of law, to speak English. That's it. It's much deeper than that. It's actually having an ancestral tie to the land. It's revering the history as your own. It's feeling an obligation to uphold the sacrifices that your ancestors made because they are your ancestors. And if they are not your ancestors, then those obligations mean nothing. You don't have those obligations, and you can't be forced to buy into them. They have no moral weight. And so, if they don't uphold those obligations, you're also not willing to remove them because you think citizenship is some sort of sacred thing, as if it was handed down from Mount Sinai on stone tablets. It wasn't. It can be stripped. It should be.
Is, I presume, education policy is as a part of that vision that you have for you trying to get those who are already here, already British citizens, to become little Brits. Do you have a vision for a sort of patriotic education? I'm imagining Suella at the helm of this.
So Suella Braverman is our shadow education secretary.
Wait for it. You already know what he's going to say. You already know which model of education he is going to cite. Get your bingo card out, everyone. The Conservative is going to say it.
And she's already indicated, and we'll be setting out further plans, that we need to be far more deliberate. I mean, you know, schools teach values. I mean, that's exactly what they do, and that's very deliberate currently. My view is that they should reflect the values of the home, but also, and ultimately parents should be in charge of their children's education. But insofar as these are publicly funded and publicly regulated bodies, they also have an obligation to the nation. And, you know, what you want is families that agree with the nation. You know, we want the parents to have the same idea as the country as a whole about the kind of kids we're trying to bring up. And that's kids.
So why did you bring in people from completely incompatible countries that hate us? Well, that was just a really stupid idea, wasn't it?
To believe in our country, where you don't have that, where you have parents who, whether just out of ignorance or, I'm afraid, in some cases, out of deliberate commitment to alternative ideas, you know, where you have children who are being brought up in homes that don't share British values, then that is a job for schools to counteract that. And I think we should be didactic in the way that, you know, Catherine Birbalsingh and other great teachers are.
Yep, we're gonna turn into the Michaela School. I'm sorry, I was so right to be against this over a year ago. I was an early adopter of saying I do not want to live in the Michaela School, and now, you know, Robert Toombs and Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman and Danny Kruger and everyone who thinks that we just have to adapt to the change that has been inflicted upon us. We have to force integration using state power, basically separating children from their parents and just hoping that the influence of their parents and their inherited culture and their ethnic identity and their religion, which they're still allowed to practice at school, by the way, isn't more influential than 5 years of reading Kipling at the Michaela School. That's what they believe. No, I think they should all go home. They should leave. We shouldn't gamble our civilization on the hope that Catherine Birbalsingh's secular Michaela School works. Terrible idea. Completely inadequate. So then Danny is asked by Emma, what does he make of the Green Party's position they want to disestablish the Church of England? And Danny's answer confirms what I said earlier, that his religion is actually liberalism, not Christianity, because he conceives of Christianity and the established church as just another beam in the liberal cathedral that is managing the relationships between competing identity community groups. And he says, isn't it great we've got the Anglican Church? Because it's an umbrella under which other faiths and cultures can shelter. So basically, our culture, our identity, and Christianity is just the container, an empty vessel for other cultures to be poured into and mix. We are the pot into which all other cultures can melt. So we don't have an identity of our own. We can just stitch foreign customs and cultures onto us like a blank canvas, like to create an incoherent tapestry of foreign cultures that we have to foot the bill for. It's as Eric Kaufman said in White Shift. Everyone else gets a booth at the World Fair, you just get to be happy that you're hosting it.
I'd say they were very anti-British on English, except for the fact there's always been this funny tradition of kind of anti-English English people, and the
Green Party isn't English. They're led by a gay Jewish man, and the rest of their activists are all Muslims. Though maybe the guy dancing on stage in a gimp suit, like he's the villain from Mad Max 2, was English. I just couldn't see it behind the leather mask. The only person that's really English are the sort of poisonous dwarf Carla Danielle, the insufferable MP, what's her name, Sean Berry for Brighton, and Hannah Spencer, who's actually quite likeable, despite her Joker goon get-up.
They're in that tradition, even though they're now, you know, largely controlled by people who come from immigrant communities. So they're an extraordinary bunch. There's something very, very it's an extraordinary phenomenon, the Green Party.
But how devastating would it be for the country if the church was disestablished?
So I think it would be catastrophic if we were to disestablish the church. I mean, what we need as a country is to be held together by a set of ideas that are not about the market or the state, that mean that there's something bigger than you or me, that in fact connect us to the wider world as well, but give us a sense of coherence, that connect us with our past, ideas that respect the inherent dignity and equality of all human beings.
But people who are not Christian do not buy into those ideas. Even Old Testament Judaism, especially Talmudic Judaism, does not think that all Jews are equal to everyone else. They think they're God's chosen people. Like, the Hindu caste system does not think that everyone is equal, even within the ethnic group of Indians. Sikhs don't believe that they are equal to Muslims and Hindus, considering they were born out of wars on the Indian subcontinent between the two factions. The only people that think that all human beings have the spark of moral dignity imparted onto them by God, Imago Dei, are Christians, Danny. And so if people aren't Christians, they don't believe it.
Actually don't require you to the state to enforce any particular belief or doctrine on the people, but that the state itself has a doctrine. That is a marvellous thing in itself. By the way, the other thing we need is a set of local institutions, rooted in every single neighbourhood, that has a particular project of supporting its local community.
So we need institutions to force people to be British. This is just Whiggish nonsense. It's the belief that the institutions exist separate from the people and act on the people rather than being staffed by people with agendas that then force the institution to correspond to their agenda. And Danny should know this because he wants to clear out the civil service of ideological activists, which means that the institution has been infiltrated and subverted, which means it's not neutral.
If we didn't have the Church of England, we wouldn't be able to invent it. It would be too difficult, too expensive, too impossible. We have it, and it's the most amazing institution. It holds us together from above and beneath. And it is obviously completely consistent with the Green Party's overall philosophy that they would want to abolish it. And
by the way, the Church of England doesn't even hold itself together because it now has an Archbishop of Canterbury that described her own role in the church as subversive in 2018. It's hemorrhaging people from the pews. That's why, among Zoomers, they're outnumbered by Catholics 2-1, and a large bulk of those Catholics are young, white, English converts, because they're running away from the Anglican Church because they can tell it doesn't stand for anything except the ideology of the state, which is just liberal multiculturalism, as espoused by Danny Kruger. Very shortly, he will say this explicitly. So people want something exclusive, hierarchical, aspirational, and which defends their identity and their interests against the groups that are competing against them in a zero-sum game for resources and recognition by the state, and are open about doing it, which is why the Green Party has become the party of the camp of the saints. Because the Green Party said, yeah, we're not for British people, we're for immigrants who want to take their stuff, and progressives who have been brainwashed into caring more about Palestine than their own immediate families. The Green Party have a constituency. What's the constituency for reforms, woolly liberalism, as incarnated here by Danny Kruger? I don't think there really is one. I think people are voting for reform because they don't want the Green Party, and they don't realise that reform actually are just going to expand the Green voter base by bringing more of these people here and refusing to deport the ones that are already here.
And it would be so bad even for non-Christians too. I mean, Jonathan Sacks, the great chief rabbi of a few years ago, always said, as a Jew, the benefit of the Church of England was that it was an umbrella under which all other faiths could shelter. It creates space for religious belief and identity as a part of people's personal identity, and it creates space for religious pluralism in the public square. So
the best thing about Christianity and the Anglican Church is that it allows other religions to take up space in the public square. The best thing about Christianity is that it isn't Christian, according to Danny Kruger. Oh, and later on in the interview, he actually says that there isn't really a rise in Christian nationalism, but to the extent there is, it's young men who are theologically unsound, who have become recent converts, who think that the fact that Christianity makes space for other religions isn't a good thing, and therefore they don't really know Christianity very well. Sorry, that's just not the case. The truth claims of Christianity are mutually irreconcilable with other faiths. And the fact that those faiths have made their hostility to our culture, our people, our faith, well known, but Danny Kruger doesn't want to remove them and instead wants to make space for them and is insistent, I don't have anything against Islam, I don't have anything against individual Muslims, just this sort of hypothetical radical Islam. And of course, without mentioning the other cultures that are also a problem, that out of habit rather than spite are demographically terraforming parts of our country into little areas of India, for example. The fact that Danny doesn't mention that and isn't willing to do anything about the problems that he admits are problems means that all of his solutions are inadequate. They have to be stepped over. We don't have time for this. We are about to have our country taken away from us, and the likes of Danny Kruger aren't going to restore our possession of it because he refuses to draw distinctions between Afghans and the English. He refuses to say that the English should have a primary claim and primary consideration in their own country. And so, reform aren't going to do what's necessary as long as Danny Kruger is their philosophical driving force. Anyway, I'll leave the full interview that you can watch uninterrupted down in the description. You can make your comments known to the New Culture Forum. New Culture Forum have said that they're going to probably host a sort of reform versus restore, or, are reform the answer debate at some point, featuring myself, Rafe, Heidelmanku, and 2 others. It would be good to get Harrison Pitt and someone on the other side, of course, involved. So we'll be able to hash this out. But well done to Emma. It's important we keep doing these interviews, because if you just let these people explain what they think, you realise this is woefully inadequate. It's delusional. We just don't have time for this.